We're returning to the book of Job today. We're going to kind of be here and there as we get started on it, but I want to start today with a quote by someone named Gilbert Metz, who said, and there's nothing very unusual in this sentiment, but there is something unusual in his story. When something bad happens in life, look for the good in it. Now that seems like common advice, right? Try to make the best of whatever situation you're in. And if many people said this to us, if we were going through a time of difficulty, our response might be, you don't know what I'm going through. You don't know how difficult this is. You don't know what it is to experience this. How can I find the good in this? We might say, who are you to say something like this? But Gilbert Metz is someone who had experienced hardship beyond what I hope any of us will ever experience. He was, in fact, a Holocaust survivor. He spent some of his teenage years at Auschwitz, where during that season he lost his mother, his only sibling, and near the end, his father. He ended up at Dachau, where he was liberated by American troops, and ended up moving to the U.S. with nothing to live with his aunt and uncle. Now, for some people, an experience like this might cause them to completely turn their back on any kind of faith. I don't know too much about his personal faith, but I do know that he was active in his faith community and his faith tradition later in life. He was someone who, in spite of all that he'd experienced, chose, as it seems, to continue to trust God in some way for the days to come. We see this also in Job, but before we get there, let's ask ourselves, when we experience losses in our own life, what's our reaction? What's our response? Does it affect our faith? Does our faith hang on the quality of our life here and now? Do we get bitter or get better when bad things happen in our lives? This is a question my mother once asked me. Do we get bitter or do we get better? Because it's a choice. You can become resentful. You can focus on the negative. It's so easy to do. There's so much of it being trumpeted in our world. Or that comes out of this. Because a Christian faith is a faith in a God who can bring the greatest good out of even what seems like the most horrible evil. Not that the evil itself is good, but that God is able to bring great good even in the face of great evil, even in the crucifixion of the innocent Son of God. We pick up our story in verse 13. Actually, before I read this, I'm going to say, just recap. Some of you may not have been here a couple of weeks ago. In the first part of Job, we meet Job, a person we're told is virtuous, blameless, and upright. Well, the narrator tells us that, God tells us that, and in a scene behind the scenes, a figure, the Satan, or the accuser, and as I said last time, this is there's some debate about whether we should understand this to be the devil, or that this is a function rather than a personal name, because it doesn't read like a personal name. But in any case, that it's kind of missing the point here to think about this as a story about the interaction between God and the devil. This character, the accuser, won't appear again after the opening chapters. And then also that, how we think about this as a kind of literature, what the whole purpose is, what the setup is, may affect the way we read this as well. But essentially you have a situation where God praises Job for being so virtuous, and the Satan says, hey, you've given him all this stuff, you've made him fabulously wealthy, and he's got all these kids, and how could he not, praise you when this is the situation? And behind that, there's this other question of, is it good policy to just always reward good behavior? Or might someone just do the good behavior for the reward? That is, what are Job's real motives? Where is his heart at? And behind that Is it best, really, for God to do this, for everything to be in lockstep? Good for good, evil for evil. And of course, we know that's not always the way the world works day to day. We're getting to that. So the Lord agrees to this test where Satan, the accuser, has the permission to take from Job. And so we hear, beginning in verse 13, one day when his house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns and made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell dead on the young people, and they are dead. They fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." 4 successive reports, one after the other, of disaster, culminating in the worst disaster, the loss of Job's children. These 4 losses, they alternate here between attacks by human raiders and what seem to be natural disasters, although I put that in quotes because of course, they would have been interpreted as somehow from God. Certainly Job does interpret them in that way. We're told, in fact, the fire from God comes in one time. It's not clear. This may refer to a thunderstorm, to lightning strikes, although it would have had to be pretty significant. It could refer to volcanic activity or maybe a meteor. But speculation on the exact nature of the disasters or the groups of people that are attacking and all of this is kind of beside the point. None of that gets at what's really in focus here. Another way of missing the point here is to feel really bad for Job's kids, because why should they get caught up in this whole thing, right? That doesn't seem fair at all. But this is not the point of the story. You're kind of getting on the wrong track if you start to. It's natural to empathize for Job's kids and wonder, how does this make sense? How can they be casualties of this story is about? The focus is on Job's loss and how Job will respond. The point is that in spite of Job's virtue, in spite of his piety, in spite of being considered blameless, which, as we said last time, doesn't mean he's sinless, but it means he's lived up to human expectations of his conduct as well as God's stated commands for him. And in spite of all this, Job suffers these losses. This is a test both of his faithfulness, and behind that, and maybe even more importantly, a test of God's justice and wisdom in governance of the world and in this situation. Now, of course, we know that because we've seen before the setup for the story, but Job isn't in on any of that. He doesn't know why this has happened to him. How will he respond? Well, first let's ask, how would you respond? How would you respond if you experienced not just one unexpected loss, but one thing after another after another? What would you want to say to God in that moment? Why me? What are you doing? This isn't fair? Or something maybe harsher? Would you want to ask, why does it even matter? What is the point of serving you, God, if it's going to be like this? If this is going to be what life is like for me? How does Job respond? Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. The first thing Job does is he grieves. Now, I think we might say, well, that's natural, that would be obvious, but it's important to note this, that Job is not unaffected by this. He's not some kind of a psychopath who doesn't have any connection to other people. He is deeply moved by the loss of his stating to him. He feels it deeply. His mourning is depicted in very strong terms here. He doesn't just say, well, easy come, easy go. I'm still healthy. I can start over. He doesn't immediately say, well, okay, I'm going to make the best of this. Right? We'll see in Job chapter 2 that sort of the next stage of the test is going to have to do with his health. That Satan's next accusation is, well, as long as he's healthy, of course, he's gonna still serve you, God. But Job doesn't say that. He doesn't say, well, at least I feel good, right? I'm not sick, so it's okay. Could be worse. Job doesn't say that. He grieves. He feels the weight of the loss. And then he worships. In fact, he prostrates himself in worship, which is unusual, falling flat on his face. It's a sign probably that he's humbling himself before God, an acknowledgement of God's power, God's sovereignty, and that he will worship God in spite of these losses. He chooses to do this instead of losing faith in God, instead of rebelling against God. He worships. Now, Job has interpreted, and we'll see in a moment, Job has interpreted his losses as being from God in some way. Now, we could get into questions about how does this work in terms of providence. The story said, God gave permission to the Satan to take these things from them, but we also have human agents, Sabaeans and Chaldeans who are involved as well. We can ask all those questions. That's kind of secondary to the story. The point is that Job understands that God is ultimately the one with whom the buck stops. God is the one who sets up the way the world works and who is active in the world. And so ultimately the question is going to come back to God, as it will again and again through the book of Job. Job here acknowledges that God has the right to take away what God has given. The assumption is that everything good comes from God, ultimately. God is the creator, is the source of anything good. We can't take credit good, but it was impossible without God's gift, God's grace, God's involvement. He also acknowledges he started out with nothing, right? He came in total dependence into the world. And also the time will come when Job will leave the world with nothing, in total dependence. This is all part of how he processes his loss and how he can come to accept it. He blesses the name of the Lord. Job does the opposite of what the accuser, the Satan, said he would do. The Satan said, hey, if you do this, if Job suffers misfortune, he's going to curse you. Now, as we saw last week, the text actually says bless you, but it's a euphemism because in Hebrew it would have been considered, to even mention cursing God would have been considered inappropriate. But the context indicates the Satan is saying he's going to curse you, but Job doesn't do that. He does the opposite of that. He blesses God. Now, this isn't the end. Next time we'll look at the next stage of the test for Job, and then the whole book is going to be a kind of examination of God's policies. This is also only the first way that Job responds. If we just read chapter 1, we'd think, Job sort of landed on his feet in terms of his faith. He's processed this. He's, just praising God. Well, there's going to be more than that, right? Job is going to have to really wrestle with what this means for the character and purposes of God as it relates to his own life, and wonder what in the world is going on here. This is an initial reaction for Job, but it's not the whole story. And I think that's important to note, because we shouldn't come away from Job chapter 1 saying, when bad things happen to us, we should just worship, right? Well, we shouldn't stop worshiping, but it's probably not the only thing that's going to go on in our lives in terms of our relationship with God. There may be more to it than this, and that's okay, but we shouldn't stop worshiping. He says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb." When we think about what it takes to be, are we content with what we started with? That is nothing? Would that be fine? Would we be content with the average in our society? If we're normal, is that enough to be content? Is it the best we've achieved so far, our kind of high water mark? Is that the mark of our contentment? Or is it always just a little bit out of our reach? If we had that next thing we wanted, would that be the place where we'd find contentment? The Apostle Paul says in Philippians, while he's in prison, "I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Notice Paul is saying that his baseline for contentment is whatever he has. That the contentment doesn't come from the things, it comes from God and from what God's done for him through Jesus Christ. Job said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there." It doesn't mean he's going back to his mother's womb. It's basically saying, I'm going to die at some point. It's another way of saying that common phrase, you can't take it with you when you go. You may have heard the joke about the guy who he wanted to take it with him when he went, so he put his treasure in the attic. And after he died, his wife went up, and the treasure was still there. And she said, "The fool, I told him he should have put it in the cellar." You can't take it with you when you go. This is lamented on in Ecclesiastes. If death is seen as the horizon, and Ecclesiastes also has, we've talked about the possibility that Job is a kind of a thought experiment. Parts of Ecclesiastes may be in some ways as well. And it's very similar to what Job says here. But in Ecclesiastes, this is kind of seen as what's the point? If this is all there is, what's the point? You've got to trust God. But as they came from their mother's womb, so shall they go again. Naked as they came, they shall take nothing for their toil, which they may carry away in their hands. This also is a grievous ill. Just as they came, so shall they go, and what gain do they have from toiling for the wind? Right? The idea is, if this is what you're living for, the accumulation of all of this, if that's where your contentment, your hope is, you're not going to keep it. Jesus says something similar of the man who places his security, his peace, his well-being, his future in his possessions. It's sometimes called the parable of the rich fool, Luke 12. But God said to him, to the fool, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." So, if you can't take it with you where you go, if this isn't our source of contentment, if we're not sure whether we're going to keep it or lose it, where do we find our contentment? Where do we find our hope? The New Testament is pretty clear that for us as Christians, our hope is staked on God's faithfulness, and we understand that we may not see the fullness of this in this life. We, in fact, may face great difficulties in this life. That our hope is staked on the faithfulness of God, the God who raised Christ from the dead and who will also raise us. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, reflecting on the resurrection, if for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Sometimes Christians will say, it's a great life, the Christian life, and there is a lot to commend it. There are a lot of benefits of living in a Christian way. Observant Christians tend to live longer and be healthier than the average person for various reasons, right? There are benefits on average, right? But this isn't the point, and this isn't guaranteed. And in Paul's case, he was suffering greatly, being persecuted almost everywhere he went, being jailed. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus is saying if your contentment is to be found in what you have here, right, it's going to disappoint you. It's fragile, as it was fragile for Job. But there is a way. There is a way to know that you have something that can't be taken. Now, of course, I've been talking about the loss of possessions, but in Job's case, he's also lost his family, at least his children. We'll see his wife is still living in the next chapter. But this is a devastating loss, and Job is going to have to wrestle with how is he going to respond to this? How is he going to make sense with this? How does he reconcile this with his understanding that God is just, that God is wise? Those are questions that are going to be worked out throughout the course of the book of Job. But his initial response of both grieving but also worshiping and blessing God is at least part of a model for us of how to process when we experience loss. That it's vital while we grieve that we don't forget that God is still good, that God is still faithful, even if we don't always understand it in the moment. And that we continue to worship even in those seasons of loss. Because the measure of God's faithfulness isn't how much we have, it's not how good we feel, it's not whether God has lived up to our expectations. The measure of God's faithfulness is the victory of Jesus Christ over sin and death and hell. Jesus had told his disciples, in the world you will face persecution, but take courage. I have conquered the world. And we saw in our call to worship this morning that part of this victory that Christ has won is that it anchors us in the truth that nothing can separate us from the love of God that he's shown us through Christ. That whatever comes, God loves us. He's made this known to us in Christ. How we feel, what happens to us is not a sign that somehow God has forgotten us, forsaken us. Not a sign that God hates us, or even that God isn't there. But rather, this is the way the world has been. The world has been torn by sin and suffering generation after generation. And yet in the midst of it stands the cross. And so we look to the cross in hope and to what happened on the other side. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.